Yeah, so we're going to get started in a few minutes here. And I didn't know if you guys had anything specific on your mind before everybody gets on. Anything that you've struggled with that you'd like maybe covered, anything on your mind. We're basically getting into like the 60,000 thoughts a day. You know what I mean? A lot of those thoughts are trash. What do we do with those? Hi, Elizabeth.
Hey,
And
Elizabeth.
yeah, we're going to be just getting into some different stuff about some of this needless suffering that is taking place in our minds and what we could do to kind of look at it differently and suffer less, right? I mean, if you guys know me, it's not like I'm walking around suffering in my mind all day. I'm freaking rocking it, right? But I'm still open to learning more about how to optimize and how to realize that those thoughts in my head are not me. It's not like all the limiting beliefs and all the shit. Like if if I treated anybody else the way that I treat myself with my thoughts, that would not be a good thing, right? So that's kind of what we're going to dig into today.
We get a few people a little bit
Yeah,
after the hour.
yeah, if it's cool with you, we're going to start it. I mean, officially start at five after, but we'll start now. But I'm saying I'll introduce you at five after.
Okay, love it.
And so there's just so much I want to dig into. And so the plan, you guys, is once a month just to do a Zoom like this and just kind of continue to evolve together. And 12 months from now, just by 1 hour a month, we're gonna be further along as far as reducing the needless suffering, and then we could help other people do the same, you know?
I just want to say, Troy is very happy to meet you. I'm going to listen. I'm just super busy single mom all the time, running on things. So I might cook, do other things. I will mute myself so I don't disturb anybody.
Good for you. Take yeah, good for you. We just had our first child, my wife and I. I don't know how you do a single mom thing. So
I have two
yeah,
teenagers.
please.
Well, they are actually in soccer in St. Pete, and I don't know when they are back. And I have dinner, everything to organize. But I'm happy to be here. I'm grateful to meet you, everyone. And I might just, do my thing. But I'm multitasking. I'm very good in multitasking, so
Beautiful.
I'm following.
Sounds good. So, Troy, if it's cool with you, I'm just gonna do a brief introduction, and if you could just kind of just talk a little bit about your history, and then
Yeah,
while you're doing that, I'm sure we'll have a couple more people jump on last minute, and then we'll roll right into it. Does that sound good?
perfect, man.
So, full transparency, everybody, I met Troy when I did a few plant medicine ceremonies, and the plant medicine is called Iboga. And this call is not about Iboga, but that's actually how Troy and I met. But no one has had as much of an impact on my life than Troy has. Like, it was just a mind blowing 3 months since I've known him. Like, it's just a whole new world, and I've advanced so much. So I asked Troy if he would come on here and just add some value for about an hour once a month so he could kind of pass on some of he taught me to you. And then he's just got that giving heart where you may or may not end up at one of his retreats in Costa Rica or who knows where, right? Or who knows how you guys grow the relationship. But there's nothing getting sold to you on these calls. This is just him showing up to add value to us. And then at the end, we're gonna have time to ask a few questions. So if there's something that you've been struggling with, like mindset wise, like your mind or anything, if a question comes to you, ask it at the end. That would be awesome. And Troy, I really appreciate your time. If you could just tell us just a little bit about your background, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, I guess first of all, just thank you all for joining. It's lovely to connect with you. My wife and I just spent a year in Sarasota, and we really, really, really loved it a lot. So it was a really good community, really sweet people. So I don't know if all of you are in Sarasota, but if you are, I just want to say we definitely appreciate the community there. Background, yeah. So I grew up in San Diego. I was raised in the foster system. My parents who adopted me were a Filipino couple. They made their way to the States through the U.S. Navy. My mother could never bear a child, so she became a foster parent, actually. I was a foster child of hers. And adopted, raised in the home. Around 18, I made my way off to college for basketball. I don't know if anyone knows anything about the foster system. Something very fascinating I wrote about a lot recently is one thing about the foster home is that, especially when you're an adopted child in one home, is the kids come and go. And so what happens is a child shows up and it becomes a brother or a sister of yours, a friend who you get very close with, and then they're torn from you. And you get close with, and they're torn from you. And it happens over and over again. So as a kid, you start to learn that connection isn't safe. And so for me, that became sort of my underlying belief, I'll call it. We can talk about the beliefs in a little bit, but I took that to college. And the way I sort of manifested was I found science. There was no feelings in science. No one asked me how I felt. No one tried to connect with me. They just gave me an experiment to run and I ran it. So I double majored biology, chemistry, finished playing basketball in college, went to grad school at UCSD for analytical chemistry, and then worked as a chemist for British Petroleum, Pfizer. Sorry. I worked for them for a little bit. I left, just, I quit. Yeah, I worked for all the pharma companies for a while. And then in 2017, I got invited to an ayahuasca retreat. Didn't know anything about it. I went down there and had literally the most transformational experience I could ever explain in my life. About a week after that, I get a text message on my phone, and it's a woman who says she saw me at the retreat, didn't get to talk to me, but afterwards she went to work with Iboga in Costa Rica. And during her May, and so I was like, okay, I guess I know where I'm going now. So I went to Costa Rica. I tried Iboga, and yeah, I won't go into the whole details, but I saw myself in Africa in a village. Went back home, took a genetics test, and found out that my father's lineage was from Gabon, Africa, where that plant's from. So I quit my job, sold my condo, broke up with my partner, and I moved to Costa Rica and went to Africa and been studying down there. And my wife and I have been carrying Iboga for the last over 5 years now. And one experience I'll just share with you is during my initiation, Iboga is a stimulant. And so one of the things it does is it keeps you awake for multiple days when you ingest a lot. And I was awake for 5 days. And the result of that is I went into what we would call in the clinical world psychosis. And what's fascinating about the psychosis was that inside of this experience, there was the mind and the experience, and there was me separate from it. And I stayed lingering in this state for about 4.5 days of Earth time. It felt like years in there. Finally fell asleep at some point. Someone gave me a pharmaceutical pill. There was a doctor there who I'm very close with still. He found out I was up for 5 days, hit me with the pharmaceutical pill. When I woke up, something interesting happened where if you look at Sean's glasses, for example, if you imagine he's looking through the world through this red tint right now. So imagine that red tint is the filter of your mind. And let's say you slept in those glasses, you wore them every day, all day, it's all you knew. But when I woke up, imagine if one of those lenses was removed. You would still see the world through the lens of the mind, but you'd see the world without it. And so at that time, I already had a second master's in East-West psychology. So I'd studied soteriology, the study of liberation, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, Hermetic alchemy, all of that. And so it all sort of just made sense experientially at that point. And now I'm in a clinical psychology doctorate program, sort of merging kind of what I've learned from indigenous ways, Eastern philosophy with the Western clinical setting, and how that's manifested is the work I do with people specifically on how to end the suffering in their life, which, as the Buddha would tell you, is rooted 100% in our minds. And so that's sort of what brought me here. And Iboga is just a tool I use for that. It's not necessary. It really can happen through experience. It can happen through words, many different ways. You don't need psychedelics or plant medicines for any of that stuff. We have it all within us. And so that's sort of what brought me here to this.
Awesome, man. Thank you for sharing. If it's cool with you, we'll jump right into that first thing that you wanted to show us.
Yeah. So I think one of the things I like starting, I'm writing a book about this right now, and this is sort of how the book starts, and it's a fascinating thing I like to do, especially when people come in a retreat. So I'm going to put something on the screen here, and I'm going to ask you a question. It's not a trick question, I promise, and then I'm going to give you guys some time, and then yeah, we'll talk about the response afterwards. And so I'm going to put something on the screen here. Can everyone see this? It's an image of sorts. So the instructions I'm going to give you are to just count the triangles. And maybe we'll set aside maybe like a minute or two just to give everyone some space. Just another 15, 20 seconds here. All right. So we'll stop it here now. If anyone wants, I could drop this in the chat box if you still need to look at it. But I'm just curious if anyone would be open to sharing what their answer was.
I think 11. Am I wrong? Probably.
11. I'm going to write these numbers in the chat so I keep track. 11.
I'm going to take a very different tact. I saw 1.
1. Okay. We got 111 so far. Angel numbers all around already.
Cool.
I think the lack of lines made it difficult for me to count because I've seen this before, but the triangle that did not have a line, I didn't know if you counted that or not.
Okay.
But there would have been, I'd say, 12.
Wow.
I was detecting 12 or 11, but yeah. Yeah.
So we have 11. We have another 11. Is that what I'm understanding? Anything else? Any other answers from anyone?
I saw 8, I think.
That was my favorite number in basketball. Glad you put that one up there. All right. Anyone else want to throw out a number?
I was with
Ooh.
the other people, 12 or 1, because I don't know what defines a triangle, isn't it? 3 defined sides, but then there were none that were totally defined, if that was the law of the land, but I don't know what the law is.
I think the law is what we make it right now. So let's,
Right,
what I'll
right.
do is I'll put it back up there.
Okay.
And I'll tell you that there is an answer to this. But before I tell you, this is a Buddhist actually teaching. In certain Buddhist traditions, they'll show you this. And what you're going to find is that the answer is 0. The reason the answer is 0 is because there are no 3 plain-sighted objects, right? Someone alluded to that. We don't see, there actually are no triangles here. Right? It looks like there is, we think there is, but there are no actual triangles by definition. And it's not really a trick question. What it's actually showing you is what the mind actually is. And this is why Buddhist teachers will show you this. The mind is an organ, just like the liver, just like the spleen, just like the kidneys. It's no different. The only difference of the mind is that its function, just as your heart has a function, its function is to make sense out of things. That's what it does. So in this example, what we start doing is we start drawing triangles that aren't actually there. And the question they'll ask you is, what if instead of triangles, we're talking about problems? What if instead of triangles, we're talking about suffering? And so it's a really beautiful example to sort of start to show exactly what the mind was. And all of us possess something in our memory bank. We know what a triangle is by definition. Problem is that the mind, there's no space between for us to actually access the memory to utilize it for what it is versus the mind using the memory on its own. And so what we're doing in our work is essentially this: we're removing the triangles from how we see reality, because that's only occurring through the mind, nowhere else. And if you study the Buddha's work, he'll tell you that the first thing he found when he reached enlightenment was he had two teachings. It's very, very fascinating, actually. The very first teaching was on the Four Noble Truths. The first noble truth is that suffering is. There's going to be suffering in this life. It's part of life. Fascinating enough, he says that the second noble truth is there is a cause of suffering. There's a reason for it, which he says is the human mind. The third part about that is he says the truth is that there's a way to end this suffering. And the fourth tier to that is the path of ending that suffering, which sort of segues to his second teaching, which he called the middle way. And what's so fascinating about this middle way is if you look at different soteriological systems, which are liberation seeking systems, this concept of the middle way is found everywhere. Absolutely. And what the Buddha said in the middle way was there is no such thing as hot. There is no such thing as cold. There is no such thing as good. There is no such thing as bad. There's actually just this one linear string that connects it all. And our job, our only job to find liberation is to exist in the middle point, to see it from the dead center. And to bring it back to this triangle analogy, the teaching, actually, what they'll say is it's something called the Heart Sutra. And the Heart Sutra says that form is emptiness, and emptiness is actually form. And so if we go back to the triangle real quick, what they're really saying is the form is emptiness. So where you see form, where you see triangles is really nothing. It's emptiness. Therefore, emptiness is what creates form. It's a very, very, very deep teaching in Buddhism, but it applies to the exact same concept of the mind. Form is emptiness. In other words, our suffering is really nothing. Therefore, nothing is creating suffering. And so I like to share this one because it's pretty insightful, and some of you were already onto it. And so my question is why don't we listen to that? Some of you already identified right away, there's no triangles there. And so the question is why don't we listen to that inner voice? What comes on and overrides it? And that's the work we do in this life according to these different soteriological systems, is understanding why that voice overrode the inner knowledge, the inner wisdom, the intuitive faculties. And so, yeah, that's how we like to start sort of, as I'm starting the book and some of these sessions like this.
Awesome, man. Do you want to jump into the story about your arm? Because that was something that was impactful that you taught me.
Yeah. And I just want to see if anyone has any, curious if anyone has any, if anything came up around that triangle. I just want to offer some space if anyone has anything to say about that or anything to share. I thought it was a silly parlor trick. If you want me to drop it in the chat, I can also do that.
I can share.
Yeah, please.
First, I thought, well, what defines a triangle? It's like definitive three sides. And then I thought, well, there are no definitive three sides. It's just what I'm thinking. But then I thought, well, I'm really bad at math and I'm probably wrong. But I also know that's a default belief that I have that has created me not even attempting to figure out something like a problem like that, because I'm just like, oh, I don't like math. I'm not good at it, because of issues from childhood, whatever, being wrong or, not having things perfect. I remember I did this long division and I was like really proud of it in fifth grade. And my mom said, let me see your homework. And I showed it to her and she's like, this is terrible. It's so messy. And she ripped it up.
Mhm.
And I was like, just traumatized from that. And anyway, I feel like I'm over it, but there's still that little thing in there of an automatic reaction that I still have inside of myself. So I don't know, do those ever go away? It's like I now have the wisdom of observation on it. Like, oh yeah, that's
Yeah.
my belief that I used to have. But when does
Y-
that story just sort of melt away and I don't even
Yeah,
have to say it
thank you
anymore?
for sharing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually what you just asked sort of segues into what Sean was talking about perfectly. And if I can just speak to that for a
Mhm.
second,
Oh,
does anybody read the book The Four Agreements? A lot of people have. So Don Miguel Ruiz is Toltec Nagual, and the Nagual means people say it means a shaman, but it's not. What a Nagual actually is, it means the force that emanates nature, which is like just beautiful if you really think about that, right? And the example they give is like there's this dense matter and there's a force that sort of allows it to be the life behind it. So that's what the Nagual is. And I got to study with his two sons down in Teotihuacan in Mexico, Don Jose and Don Miguel. And one of the things they do, talking about beliefs, which you're alluding to, is they use an analogy of a brick wall, actually. And what they say is that each of is a belief that we carry in our lives. And brick by brick, we form this entire psychic structure that becomes our reality. And this could be a reality like, I'm not good at math, so therefore I shouldn't trust my intuition. This could be a reality that when I submit assignment, someone's going to come down on me. Or for me, a reality about my arm, which I'll speak to in a second. So brick by brick, we put these beliefs in our structure and we build this entire psychic reality, is what they say. And it's really just this giant brick wall. And what they ask in this, they say if the brick is a belief that we carry, right? If each of these bricks are a belief, then my question for you all is what would you call the concrete? Because the only thing holding up these bricks is the concrete. So if the brick is a belief, the concrete is, and according to Don Miguel Ruiz, it's your faith. It's the faith that we put into that structure is what keeps it going. The belief isn't what's important. The belief is just a brick. It's the faith that we put into it. And so another way to talk about what we're actually doing in this work is we're taking the faith out of the structure. And the Toltec people say that when we're first born, we enter something called the dream of the first attention. And what that means is where were we first forced to place our attention? And so for you, it might be you were forced to place your attention in these things like I'm not good at math. For me, I was forced to place my attention into things like relationships aren't safe. And so society as a young age, because we're just kids, we don't have a say. Parents are so big and we're so small, right? Like, what are we going to do? Society tells us where to put our faith. If anyone's Christian or Catholic, I was raised Catholic myself. If you know the fifth commandment, anybody know that? It's honor thy parent. And so what you see a lot of times is in someone's structure, they have a brick that says you have to honor your parent. You have to. Well, I had a guy I was working with who dad would throw hot coffee in his face if he chewed too loud at a dinner table growing up. And so his whole life, he had this bent up anger towards his father that he never felt he could express. Why? Because he had a brick in his structure that said, I must honor my parent. And the reason that brick was there is because his faith put it in. And so what they say is that we build this structure originally in our life called the dream of the first attention. And what they say is very few people, 99% of the world will live and die in that dream, but very few people wake up to the dream of the second attention. And the dream of the second attention is when we dismantle the structure, and now we start building a structure which is our beliefs. What beliefs do we want to put into it? And there's other dreams of attention that we can talk about later, but I just want to share something about the dream of the second attention. It sort of alludes to what Sean was talking about. So when my mother, my biological mother, when she was pregnant with me, she used heroin. She was a sex worker, HIV positive. They didn't know if I had HIV for the first 10 years of my life. They had to keep testing me over and over again. But one of the products of that was my right arm never fully developed. Mhm. And so in my elbow here, you have your humerus bone and you have the radius and ulna, which connect to the humerus. The reason you can rotate your wrist is because those bones rotate around the humerus. Well, mine are fused together. So I can't rotate this right wrist at all. And so I get to high school and I'm a basketball player and everyone knows me. And I'm like, I'm going to be on varsity as a freshman. I'm going to date the prettiest cheerleader. I had this whole story in my head. And we start tryouts for basketball. And the coach has us put a paddle in one of our hands like this. And what we're supposed to do is stand on the rim and do wrist flips and just toss the ball in. Well, I can't do that with my right arm because I can't rotate my wrist. And I never knew this at the time. So I'm like, what is going on? And so I go up to the coach and I'm like, hey coach, I can't do the drill. And he goes, what do you mean? And I'm like, I can't rotate my wrist. And he grabs my arm. He goes, what? And he was looking at my arm. And he says, what's wrong with you? Sort of like when you turn in an assignment and your mom said, this is terrible, right? This is messy. He said, what's wrong with you? And I said, I don't know. And he said, well, then excuse my French. He said, get the fuck out of the gym. I'm not going to have a different word I'm not going to say, a special needs kid, and get out of my gym, is what he said. I'm not going to have a special needs kid on my team. And he cut me from the team on the spot. And in that moment, what happened is I put a brick in my structure that said that something's wrong with me. That brick wasn't there before. It was now. I put my faith into that brick, and now it became a central brick in my structure. And so I came back sophomore year, he cut me. He ended up getting fired. Was the only one to get a scholarship to college. But even in college, I wouldn't shoot. I would wear long sleeve t-shirts. I would do anything I could to hide my arm because I didn't want one person to even notice something was wrong with me because that brick was still in my structure. And so very long story short is through working with Iboga and these different plants, I no longer carry that belief. And so the question I like to ask, which Sean's alluding to, is I still can't rotate my wrist. So what healed? We talk about healing, right? My question is what healed? I still can't rotate my wrist, but yet I can wear tank tops, I can talk about it, I can show people. So what healed is the question. And so it starts to really engage this conversation around the idea of healing itself. And sometimes I wonder, what if it's less about healing and more about remembering our divine nature, our wholeness, our completion? And in this case of the brick analogy, all that really happened was I removed the faith that there was something wrong with me. That's all I did. I still can't rotate my wrist. If you give me that damn paddle, I still can't do the drill he told me to do. That guy's probably somewhere coaching somewhere, and I still couldn't do his drill. But I'm healed. And so it sort of shows what the Toltec people are talking about. It's very fascinating how they talk about this dream of the first attention. And then, like I said, when you tear down that first wall, we enter the dream of the second attention. And that's the dream that we sort of put our faith into, our bricks into of our own accord. And then they have something called the dream of the third attention, which is when we stop making it about our own bricks and we start making it about collective, right? What brick am I going to put into my structure that's benefiting all of humanity? It's no longer just about me. And so really what we talk about in our retreat work when we work with people is if we said we had to have one goal, one purpose, it's to help people to dismantle that first structure. And if they want to stay in that second one, good, because at least it's your beliefs. You can put it in whatever you want. And for those people who feel called, how do you dismantle that second structure and go into a third structure of service is what it really is, of serving others. And so I think if that's what Sean was asking about, right, Sean, that was about the story about my arm. And so it's just a reminder, yeah, when we talk about healing, sometimes I try to shift the narrative sometimes it's true, right? I have a woman with traumatic brain injury and she's working with Iboga specifically for what it does to the physical brain. There's healing that occurs there. It's a fact. I have MRI scans that show it. And then there's also a different level of healing we talk about that's really about remembering in our beliefs and then where are we putting our faith into.
Yeah, that was a big takeaway for me is just leaving the first time we met in a place of wholeness. And ever since I left that retreat, it's like I'm coming from a place of wholeness for the first time in my life because a lot of those bricks, the whole wall came down because my faith in a lot of the beliefs I had got just crumbled. And so now I'm still on this journey doing all this cool shit with like biohacking and seminars and all that type of stuff, but it's from a place of wholeness instead of from a place of lack. And so that was huge, huge for me, man, when you explained that to me.
Yeah, I mean, the definition of healing, if you Google it, it says a lack of wholeness or a return to wholeness. And so, like I said, there are cases where people are healing things. That makes a lot of sense. And there's a lot of cases where I'll ask people, I say, so are you telling me you're not whole? And that something I'm going to give you is going to make you whole? And when people really stop and contemplate that, they start to understand how disempowering they're actually standing in. And if any of you work with Dispenza work, I mean, you know that once he really gets you into that place, one of the main vibrations we carry is gratitude in there, right? And it's not really with our words; it's more so an essence we carry. And so when we say we're out for healing, in some cases it's a fact, sure, and in a lot of cases, what we're really saying is I'm not whole. And so if we are popping in and out of this quantum realm, all these moments like Dispenza's talking about constantly all day, that means what we're really putting there is lack, a lack of wholeness. And so simply by understanding this idea of remembering versus healing, what you do is you shift what Sean's talking about to being whole constantly. Now your vibration you're emitting is vastly different. You can still do acupuncture, you can still do Reiki, you can still do all the things, go talk to a therapist, but do it from a place of wholeness. Instead of searching for healing, we search for remembering. And so one of the main mottos we have at our retreat is that, yeah, we're here to remember who we are, remember our wholeness. It's never left us. There's nothing to heal sometimes, right? And so it's just a very interesting way of sort of framing it. And what it does, really, at the end of the day, is it removes the beliefs from the structure, the faith. And as soon as the faith comes, the structure comes crumbling down. And it's a really beautiful thing because the only thing keeping us from seeing our true self, what yogic tradition talks about, the Atman, the self, all these things, the only thing that's keeping us from that is that structure. And that structure is the mind. So when the structure collapses, we get to gaze upon the self. And the more time you spend viewing it, yeah, the more it comes back with you and it changes you. It transforms you in a way that very few things can.
Wow. Um, Anybody have a question or a comment before we move on?
I have maybe a question. What's your view with what Dr. Joe Dispenza is doing? Because I think I believe that there is like a teaching in so many different things and ways and people and and type of work that we can find out there. Like I find my own healing different with different method. I don't think like one heals all. I think you just find a kind of key of answers in so many different things, like Buddhism, like Joe Dispenza,
Yeah.
thing, like you know.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful question. And if there's one sort of insight I can tell you. So just so you know, when I came back from my ayahuasca retreat, someone in the airport handed me Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. That
Okay.
was the first quote unquote like self-help spiritual book I ever read in my life. And so Joe Dispenza inspired me the same way he approaches meditation, I approach Iboga. And I think one of the biggest gifts that he has done is science has become sort of a quasi-religion in our modern day society.
Mhm.
And what he's done is he's able to leverage that to get past that analytical brain to allow people to have these really deep transformative experiences. So that to me is his number one gift that I've really seen him offer. The stuff he does in his seminars is amazing, the group healings, and he's changing the structure. He's putting new beliefs in people's structure. There's faith now that like collectively we can heal one another. It's a beautiful thing. Um, and just in my humble personal opinion, the one area where I don't necessarily agree with
Mhm.
is that when we do get in those altered states, I personally don't hold the vibration of gratitude. inside of those. I don't hold any frequency actually. And the reason is because of what the Buddha talked about, the middle way. What I actually do is I find a place of complete equanimity and neutrality. And what I found is that when I hold love, I'm also holding hate because they're not different. They're just two sides of the same string. The law of polarity from the Hermetic principles said that hot is cold and cold is hot. There's no difference, right? If you find a country that has peace, that's because they had war. If you had a country that has war, it's because they had peace. You don't have one without the other. That's what the middle way is all about. And so the one thing I do differently is when we get into those same meditation, I use the same sort of trance induction techniques. I was trained in past life regression therapy. The same things. It's just when I get in there, I encourage people to find nothing. No vibration of gratitude, no vibration of love, obviously no vibration of hate. We find perfect equanimity, and when we come back out, we take that with us. And I do personally believe that gratitude is the closest frequency, but one thing people forget is neutrality is unconditional love, right? Like love and hate are just two sides of the same string. The only way to have unconditional love is to have no conditions. And to have no conditions, you can't be off balance. That's why Buddha nature is that's why the middle way is such a profound teaching. And there's another way that you can show that. If in Buddhism, what they'll do is they'll show you a rose. And what they'll do is they say, the reason why you see ugly, and you throw this rose away, a dead rose, is because something is off balance. And we all understand that intuitively, right? You see a dead rose. If you have dead roses on the counter, what do? You throw them away. And so we all understand that. The reason you see a rose and you see it as ugly is because something is off balance. And then what they'll do is they'll show you a brand new rose. Smells amazing. And they'll say, the reason you see beauty is because, and the intuitive part wants to say, because it's balanced, like it's the perfect place. And they'll say, because something is off balance. And you're like, what? I saw beauty and it's off balance. And I see ugly and it's off balance. I see life and it's off balance. And I see death and it's off balance. How does that make sense? And then you start to understand what they're about. They're talking about equanimity or neutrality or unconditional love. And so for me, if there's a certain vibration or frequency I try to hold, it isn't a vibration or frequency, it's neutrality. And from that, I can express this amount of unconditional love towards people and towards things that like you can feel it. And when people touch that state, it's a different frequency because it's not a frequency. It's the one thing void of all polarity. And if there's ever you listen to a Ram Dass song, it's called Sitting Around the Fire. Some of you have heard it. It's a beautiful, beautiful Ram Dass song. And the first thing he says is, between all polarities or beyond all polarities, I am. Let the judgments and opinions of the mind be judgments and opinions of the mind. It's how he starts the song off. But there's something to that, the beyond the polarity thing. And so just to go to your thing on Joe Dispenza, he is like hero of mine. But that's the one thing I do different with the people we work with, and it's just because of the Buddhism stuff. Yeah.
So what about coming from a neutral place and like I'm experiencing love from a centered neutral place. I'm experiencing gratitude and abundance from a centered neutral place. So I'm not like to some crazy extreme here. I'm centered, but and then I got some sadness, but from a centered neutral place, I'm back. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that's the real gift of it, right? Because you're not stuck on needing to be happy. Obviously, you don't want to be sad, but there's this sometimes the happiness becomes its own sort of desire or attachment. And if we remember from Patanjali's teachings from the Yoga Sutras, there's 5 things that cause us suffering in our lives, he says. The first one is the soil in which the other 4 grow, and that's ignorance. So what Patanjali, the curator of the Yoga Sutra, says is that if you can solve the ignorance from your life, you don't have to worry about anything else. But after that, the next one's egoism. The third one's aversion. The fourth is attachment. And the fifth is fear of death. And so attachment isn't just attachment to hate, attachment to something bad. It could be attachment to gratitude. It could be an attachment to love. Because what happens when you lose that? What if something in your life happens where you're not grateful for? right? You were walking down the street and you see a child get hit by a car, something horrific happens. Then what? I just had a woman I was working with at a retreat we had in Sedona last year, and sweetest lady ever, has her master's in childhood psychology with an emphasis on childhood suicide. And this woman's daughter killed herself. And if she travels the world now lecturing and speaking to just millions of people about how to prevent this from happening, right? So she obviously had a very specific sole purpose. She came into this life, got a master's in it, and years later it happens to her own daughter. And now she's helping all these countless people in the world. And one of the things we sort of found for her was that she was never neutral. She only ever wanted to be this, in her case, it was she wanted to live in the pain. She wasn't enjoying the bliss from helping people, and she was just staying in the pain. But at least if you're coming from the middle space, like Sean's talking about, you can accept the fact that there's pain, and you can accept the fact that there's helping people. You don't get addicted to one extreme polarity. So that's the real value of the middle way. It doesn't mean life stops. It just means you can enjoy each polarity for what it is without being biased. Yeah, did you have a question for that?
I do. You were talking about the wholeness, and then it is I perhaps got it confused, but if love is the other side of hate and joy is the other side of sadness, then whole is the other side of dis-ease.
Exactly.
Yes. So then I wanted to get into an idea, and then I'll be quiet, maybe. I wanted to get into an idea of one of the things I have not heard Dr. Joe go into, and my whole life has been about the power of prayer for others, as well as myself. But how would you address suffering when you see it in another individual? And I think what I heard you say is when you are addressing them, you are coming from a place of perceiving and having faith in their inherent wholeness. And the suffering is a temporary, I'm going to say facade that they are wearing or embodying at the moment until they remember who they are. Can you touch on that? Because in my family, I can see, and I have a tendency to do this. If someone in my family were in pain, I would go to the macro view of them as a soul having an experience in this point of time. And in that macro view, this is about their journey, and there's nothing so-called wrong with it. Even if I had to go to what you spoke about, the unthinkable, that mother's daughter's suicide. So I'll be quiet now.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. Valerie, we'll come back to you in a moment. So I guess the first part is, yeah, so one of the most important things to remember is that um, if we, and Joe talks about this a lot, if we have an internal state of a vibration like hate, our entire body chemistry shifts. And we know that. You can measure your blood chemistry and you'll see it's a very acidic environment. And so sometimes the first logical step is to help someone see wholeness, right? That's the first step in the process, because you can't just take people to the end. That is like moving from the dream of the first attention to moving to the dream of the second attention. The truth is, it's still a brick wall. It's just a brick wall that you have. So at least if you're gonna have a brick wall, at least be a brick wall of wholeness, because now your life is vastly different, right? The dream of the third attention is still a brick wall, but it's a brick wall about life itself, about everyone. And this will sort of touch to your question a little bit. What's fascinating is that when I was in Teotihuacan, I asked the brothers about this dream of the first, second, and third attention. And I said, well, what happens if you destroy the third wall? And he said, oh, the bricks that would build up again, and it would become even more about others. And I said, what if you did that again and again and again? I kept saying that. And one of the brothers was talking to me at that moment, Don Miguel Jr. He's the more logical one. Don Jose is his other brother, who's the spiritual one. They're both spiritual, but
Yeah.
and Don Jose wasn't talking at the time. And when I said that, he looks up and he opens his eyes really big, like massive. And he leans forward and he says, "That's what the Nagual does." And he just leaned back. And so what we have to understand is that the full process of transforming your mind isn't about having a structure at all, right? It's there's the goal is to have no structure and to constantly dismantle it over and over and over again. And so I just wanted to speak to that in terms of like just name that first. And now to address the part about the family, we have to remember that suffering is a teacher. So for some people, they're going to suffer in this life. It's part of their journey. Some of the most profound teachings I've received have come through suffering. So it's like the Buddha said, suffering is, and it's optional. And so the definition in the dictionary you'll find of suffering is, or I mean, of compassion is to suffer with. So what we're taught is that when someone else is suffering, I have to have compassion for them, which means I'm going to suffer with them. What I'm saying is some people don't need to suffer. I don't need to anymore. So I'm not going to have to suffer with. I'm just going to be with. So when there's people in the family who are suffering, I just witness that. Because the truth is, with the triangle analogy, how do we know there's a soul? Remember, Buddhism has the anatta, the no self. Form is emptiness and emptiness is form. They're saying that the soul is really emptiness. They say it's a part of memory and a few things that come together to make it look like a soul. Just like a car is a collection of parts. They say a soul is a collection of parts. If you take away the front windshield, it's still a car. Take away the tires, still a car. Start stripping things away at some point, we're not going to call it a car anymore. And so the real goal of what we're talking about here, the goal is to dismantle the structure altogether. And when we do that fully, and we keep doing that, we don't even have to see them as a soul going through their experience. We can just ultimately be with them in that experience. And if you've ever had a really, really good therapist, the best therapist I've ever met in my life, that's what they do. They're just in that room with you and you're having your experience, you're talking about things, you're feeling it, and they're just completely there, open with you. That's what Mother Teresa did. That's what St. Francis of Assisi did. All of these divine teachers who have guided us through humanity, no structure. So I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but that's how when I work with people, I mean, the people I work with, some of the stuff they're going through, your jaw would drop to the floor. And the only way you can do that is not to even see them as a soul. I get it. The soul's going through experiences and yeah, but to see nothing, to find perfect equanimity. Now you're with somebody in a way that it's different and they feel it because they feel so held by you, not held from you because you see them as a soul, held from you because you're just with them, period.
What they would say is, I feel heard, I feel seen,
Yeah,
I feel known,
yeah,
as it were. Oh, thank you very
yeah.
much.
You're very welcome. Yeah. Valerie, did you have a question as well? Your necklace is beautiful, by the way.
Thank you. No, I was actually going to say, most people I meet, especially open-minded, more spiritual people, there's not one single who didn't went through, big sufferance. And I personally, my view in this is that suffering is like a transformation. It's
I see.
actually a blessing. I mean, I'm not saying that I love to suffer, but with all if I didn't have the suffering that I had from even childhood very young, I wouldn't have transformed to what I'm today. And as you say very well, is like, I don't feel today I need to suffer as much because basically the sufferings help you to go deeper in yourself.
Mhm.
It's and until you see and go deeper, and I have unfortunately example around me. I have someone, ex-husband, unfortunately, who keep having issue after issue, but he still don't see. He still don't go deep enough. He still don't do the work because it's hard to do the work. But that's kind of part of the process. The more you do the work, with your sufferance or your experience in life in general, the more you get to this balance and the more you see. And I don't know, it's just, and as you say, there's so many different techniques. We talk about Joe Dispenza. I'm a big follower of Lee Harris, which I love.
Mhm.
Basically, it's funny because they say the same thing differently. They
Yeah.
words, they, as you actually say certain things, that's why I talk about Joe. But you say, okay, we are in a place of neutrality, but all together, it's just different words and way, and which one resonates to you that you are going to listen to, so you do the work and the process for your own transformation. I mean, that's
Exactly.
how I feel it personally. So that's why I'm taking,
It's
and thank you. I'm taking what you say. I'm taking what Joe, I'm taking from Yeris, I'm taking from Buddhism. I'm taking about everything. Because that's, I think, what we have. We have to be completely open, because there's not one single only perfect, lesson.
yeah.
There's
You know, what you said right there is everything. When I was in Africa last, I'm part of the Bwiti tradition, so I'm initiated several times, this whole thing. And you have to understand the Bwiti is almost like you gotta follow, right? And so what they wanted me to do was to cut my hair. It would allow me to step into manhood. And it's a ceremony you go through. And I was out there in Gabon. Imagine I'm sitting in front of a Nima, a shaman, and he's telling me why I need to cut my hair. And what I tell him back is, you're living in a box. I'm not in the Dispenza box. I'm not in the Bwiti box. I'm not in
right.
a Michael Singer box. There's no boxes. That is what it means to dismantle the structure over and over. And the brain's going to keep building a structure because that's what it does. Our job, in my opinion, on my work, is how do I keep dismantling that structure over and over and over again. And then you really understand what the Nagual does. It's a different world. So yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. I think we lost our moderator.
I'm still here. I was just going to give you a notice once you hit 9:15 and see if anybody has any questions to wrap it up. The one other thing, if there's no questions, there is one other thing that I want to ask, but I'll let it sit for 15 seconds to see if anybody has anything else on their mind.
Hi guys, I had one question. So I understand your Buddhism and the middle line. I mean, kind of. I think my question is how do you deal with the physical manifestations or pain, and then how do you deal with, do you just keep going back to the mind? How do you deal with when your body is still catching up to your mind, as far as the healing process? Because I'm going through something like that. And that's what has been kind of a daily challenge for me, that I've having been to approach it with meditations. And because sometimes you just lose hope, you don't feel like getting into that state or doing whatever. Sometimes the medical results show something else, but that's not true because you feel great. And I don't know, for me it's been like quite a journey. So that's what I understand, the philosophical way of thinking about
Mhm.
this. But when you are like in your body, do you just have to get out of it and concentrate on the
No,
mind, or how do you approach that
no,
physical healing
yes.
process?
So a perfect example is if you put your hands like this, right? Yeah, it's fascinating. So I'm gonna ask you a question. Very, very simple one. How do you know that you have hands?
I see
You,
them,
you see
I
it.
feel
Perfect.
them.
Perfect.
Mhm.
You see them. So that's called your vision. Now let's close your eyes for a second. Now I'm gonna ask you the same question. How do you know you have hands?
I feel them.
You feel them? Okay, what do you feel?
Warmth, I guess.
Okay. Okay, so just stay with the eyes closed.
Okay.
Warmth, just the way you just use your vision to see them. Now you're using your mind to label them, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
warmth is just a label. I might call it a tingling. You call it warmth. Someone else might call it a buzzing. We don't know. So I'm going to ask you the same question again. No moving, no looking, and no using the mind to label. How do you know you have hands? And you're
Mm.
going to notice there's no words. You can't even say anything. There's just a feeling that's in there, correct?
Yeah.
So now just allow your awareness to be with that sensation beyond the label of the mind completely and stay in that for a moment. And what you're going to observe is the observer, you, and the observed, that sensation, are going to become one and the same. You're not going to be able to tell the difference between the two at some point. It's going to become one field. So when you ask me, what do I do when there's something in my body? I do that. I stay with it so much so that the observer and the observed become one, because the problem really isn't what's coming up in the body. The problem is that we have a sensation which says, let's say this iPod case or this headphone case is that sensation.
Uh-huh.
That sensation is the fact. It's true. Then what happens is our mind comes in and it labels it and it says, this is warmth. But that warmth is just a label of your mind. As long as that label's on there, you're not dealing with the fact anymore. You're dealing with the mind's label of the sensation. And the reason you use the word warmth is because you learned the word warmth through your memory. You have it in your memory. So you're not even dealing with the sensation, you're dealing with the past, which is called memory. And so what we're doing is we're working through, how do you know you have hands? I have this thing called vision. I can see them. Okay, close your eyes. I can move my hands. I have this thing called movement. Stop moving. I can feel them. What do you feel? I feel warm. Stop labeling it. There's nothing else to do now. There's just you and a sensation. And when you stay in it, you're going to merge with it. This is David R. Hawkins' book, The Letting Go, The Pathway of Surrender. This is his entire technique you read in chapter 2. This is the letting go technique. It's doing that. What he says, though, is that when you put your awareness into an emotion, it's going to turn into an elevated emotion. What I'm saying and what Patanjali from the Yoga Sutras is saying is that when you put your awareness into an emotion beyond the label of the mind, you're going to merge into it. It's going to become one. There's going to be no more it. So if you're putting your awareness into a disease, the disease will be gone. You'll become it. I've had people cure arthritis like this inside medicine ceremonies, just doing this. I've had people cure things you would not believe by becoming it. There's no more it. Does that make sense at all in terms of an answer? Hopefully that answers your question a little bit.
I guess what I don't quite understand, we live with our eyes open most of the time. So you just mean like this is how you deal with it. Like this is how you kind of merge into it.
Exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. And my teacher is a Native American man. His name is Steve Montoya. He's in Española, New Mexico. He's one of the most gifted, and I'll use the word healer with him. Um, he's one of the most gifted healers you're ever going to find in the world. He flies all over the world at this point. And he took me to the desert once in New Mexico and dropped me off. I kid you not, this is a true story. And when I got out of the car, I was like, what are we doing, man? And he says, how do you know you have hands? And I said, what? And I was like, I can see them. He said, those are just your eyes. Stop. How do you know you have hands? I did the same thing I just did with you. And once I just sat there quiet, he said, go, good. Now go do that. And he left. I kid you not, this is a true story. And for about an hour, I didn't do anything. I was looking at rocks. I was walking around, da 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 da. And I finally did it. And about some time into it, I felt something I thought pinched my spinal cord, like stung me. I thought it was a scorpion. And I jumped up and I'm looking around. I'm like, there's nothing here. So I sat back down and now I'm a little cautious, but I started doing it again. Sometime later, I don't know when, I felt another a jolt in me. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? And so I did it again, but this time with my eyes open, with the drishti gaze, right? Because a lot of meditation practice, you keep your eyes open. So I did the drishti gaze and I'm sort of just in my hands. I did the same thing. How do I know I have hands? I'm in the sensation, just staying with it. So it becomes one. There's no more it. There's no more me. It's a merger. And all of a sudden, the background, I see a flash and I feel the jolt. And there was a lightning storm starting to come towards me. And in that moment, I understood what he was teaching me, that sensation in our hands, it's the same thing that I'm feeling is the same thing that you're feeling. The same thing that Sean's feeling is the same thing that Elizabeth is feeling. The difference is we label it differently. It's the same thing in the plants. It's the same thing in the lightning. It's the same thing in our earth. It's the same sensation in every single thing. So when we talk about the Nagual being the force that emanates nature, that sensation is the Nagual. The difference is as soon as we put our mind on it, we've labeled it and we've lost it. So what I'm trying to share with you here is an opportunity to go beyond the labels that your mind might call of a sickness, of an illness, of something, of disease, and to just fully be with that sensation to the point where the observer and the observed will become one. And if you were to read the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, this is his entire practice of yoga. It's called union. This is literally what he says happens. When you observe something, you merge to it, and there's a union. There's no more it, there's no more you, there's not even the object of meditation. They've all become one. The disease can't exist in that. Disease is separate. And so
Cool.
you'll be surprised what you find when you remove all the layers and become something. Yeah,
Oh, thank you.
you're very welcome.
So before we go,
There's something in the chat real quick. I just want to make sure.
yeah.
Basi. And Basi in the African tradition means truth. It's like, it's another way of saying like, fuck yeah. I wouldn't say ether because ether is one of the elements. Um, I actually believe that the ether is, um, we talk about a fish in water not knowing it's water. I think when we talk about really what unconditional love is, which we could also say is ether, to me, this empty space is what love really is. Because when you talk about love being the thing that connects all things, then empty space is what connects all of us together right now. We're not separate unless you count the fact that there's empty space between us. But if you see empty space as something, then we're not separate. We're connected through it. And so to me, ether is love, you could say. It's what love really means. It's the essence of love. It's the thing that connects all things. Connected. These palms are connected through love. There's no empty space here for me in my world. There's something there now. So that's, yeah, the Nagual, Basi. Exactly. Yeah, there's a book by Don Miguel Ruiz called The Voice of Knowledge, if anyone's curious. It's not one of his most known books, but it's his deepest book. And what it's going to do is can help you remove or help you understand what knowledge is, specifically knowledge. And for me, that was one of the first steps I took for really living beyond my mind was understanding what knowledge was as a product of the mind. And he goes into that book. It's really, really beautiful, beautiful book. Sorry, Sean, you were saying something, dude?
Yeah, I had one more question, but if anybody else has anything, I any other questions on anybody's mind before I go?
I want to just mention, if I can, uh, to Troy, when I jumped on this, I go into these sort of things thinking, okay, I don't know what this is going to be completely about, but if I can pick up one gem, it was worth it. Troy, you have opened up a rabbit hole for me. I don't need more rabbit holes, but this has been absolutely fantastic. I have loved every minute of it. Thank you so much.
I appreciate you, sir. Yeah, I think that if I may just share one little last thing that I think is very important. Has anyone ever read the work of Alice Bailey? Elizabeth, you actually remind me of her, believe it or not. Yeah, you have an Alice Bailey vibe. Alice Bailey was an old esotericist. They believe that she channeled a being known as the Tibetan. But if you look at her books, she has a bunch of these books. They're when you read them, they're like you have to read for like the same page over and over again. They're deep. But two of her books specifically are Esoteric Psychology and Esoteric Psychology 2. And one of the most interesting tenets of that, which is going to speak to what's going on here, is she says that it's not mankind who's evolving, it's consciousness that's evolving through the faculty of man, which I think a lot of us might be aware of. And she says, right, like first it moves through the mineral kingdom, and you have these different minerals that are attracting each other and repulsing. And so there's a consciousness there. Then it gets into the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom. We all know those are conscious beings. But she says when it moves through the kingdom of man, what happens, excuse me, is that it has 4 different planes in which it works through. The first plane is a polarization of consciousness into the physical faculties of man. And how they say that manifests is she draws the analogy of the caveman. And she says, look at the caveman, the way it lived. Consciousness was focused on physical faculties, that's survival, reproduction, food, shelter. So where did it pour its consciousness? Into survival. And she says, what happens from that is it drove the evolution of man. It drove the body, the physical body, to evolve, to help it. So it no longer had to focus on survival. It could move somewhere else. And what it did was it helped the frontal lobe grow. And if you think of the frontal lobe, it's a problem solving tool. I want some pizza right now. I grab my phone and there's pizza here in like 10 minutes. I don't have to survive anymore. Survival's taking care of me because I have this frontal lobe. So consciousness first polarized the physical faculties of man and drove the evolution of the human brain in the frontal lobe. And then she says what happens is consciousness moves into the next polarization of the faculties of man. And that's a polarization of consciousness into the emotional faculties. And she says from like 1930, when she wrote this, to like another 200 years from now, most of mankind is going to be polarized in this sort of plane. Consciousness is going to be polarized in the emotional faculties. Look around the world. Trauma, 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 trauma. One of the reasons I love Joe Dispenza is because he doesn't really talk about those things as much. He has a completely different approach. And so what she says is, again, it's going to drive the polarization of consciousness. It's going to drive the change of the physical body. She doesn't say this, but in my book, my argument is that that is called the intrinsic cardiac nervous system. You have a set of 30,000 neuronal cells in your heart. You can think with your heart, but there's no intellect. So there's no suffering. So you can still experience emotion, the vibration itself, because that's a part of life, but there's no suffering involved with it when you live through the heart. That's what indigenous people are trying to teach us. So consciousness first polarizes in the physical polarization, and then it goes through an emotional polarization, which everyone's in right now. And now, speaking to what you're naming about the curiosity, very, very few people on this planet who, in my opinion, are the people who get on calls like this. Consciousness begins to shift into a polarization into the mental faculties. Joe Dispenza has a polarized consciousness in the mental faculties. The teachers of the yoga traditions and all those guys, polarization and consciousness into the mental faculties. There's a reason. So we go physical, emotional, mental, and the last plane is a polarization of consciousness into the spiritual faculties. In the book I'm writing, my argument is if consciousness is driving the evolution through every phase, the frontal lobe, the intrinsic cardiac nervous system, and the mental polarization, it's what Patanjali teaches in the sutras, that when you use concentration, because he says there's no such thing as meditation. He says you can have sustained concentration on an item, concentrate, that's the effort. Through consistent effort of concentration, it builds into meditation. And that meditation blossoms into contemplation. And contemplation is when the observer and the observed become one. So now there's just one in me, and now they're indistinguishable. And I'm one with it. I believe that's what grows in us, that allows us to move from a polarization of consciousness from the physical, emotional, mental. And the last plane is a spiritual polarization. And what she says is those are like the master Jesuses and these enlightened beings who have walked these earth that can do these things. You're like, how the fuck do they do that? Like those Buddhist guys who are turning into rainbow light, right? Well, so what's fascinating is if you think about that, if we're all in the emotional, the mental's the next plane, and the spiritual is where consciousness ends. And that means all we have to do is transcend the mental part. So now when you hear me talk about mind transcendence, this is what I'm actually talking about. So to go back to what you're saying, what I hear you saying from my side of it is that your consciousness is polarizing into a whole new plane. And that's a beautiful, beautiful thing to acknowledge because there's a lot of people who just aren't there, and that's okay. And there's some people who are starting to see that and live in that. And so I just want to say to you, from me to you, when you say that to me, I hear that. I see consciousness moving through you as a polarization into the mental and the spiritual faculties mostly. And that's a beautiful thing. I mean, if you look at autism spectrum disorder, people think those kids, there's something wrong with them. There's not. Their consciousness is polarized more into the mental plane than ours. There's less emotional polarization. It's not a disease. It's an evolutionary step. And so, yeah, I mean, it's beautiful to see sort of these communities kind of coming together. And the people we work with, Iboga, we tell people, we're like, the chances of working with Iboga and my wife and I is like, you have a higher chance of hitting the California Super Lotto twice than working with us. And so what I always say is, why the fuck are you here? If it's that rare, like if you hit the lotto twice, why? What are you meant to do with that money? I'm curious, right? And so people who are ready to start living beyond the mind, there's a reason. It's not by chance. And so for me, that's something I honor in all of you for just being on this call. So thank you. Yeah, I just want to speak to that, man, because yeah, that's what I hear.
Absolutely amazing, man. I'm gonna save mine for next call. Guys, we're gonna do this once a month, and I'm welcome to any feedback, and we'll kind of see how this flows. Next month, there might be a couple people on your heart that you want to invite, and let's just continue to evolve together, you know?
Voila.